So the title is A Fine Education, National Park Seminary, National Park College, 1894 to 1942. I don't want to assume that everybody here has been on one of our SOS regular monthly tours in the last 5 years or so since the renovations have been completed. Or maybe last night you might not have stayed up late studying your copy of the SOS book, or even better, I'm shocked to think that possibly some of you haven't yet bought the new edition of the book, which Don will gladly sell to you after the meeting is over, after the presentation is over. So let me give you a really quick, very quick version of the history of the school so that we'll get that set up. This is my one-screen thing. 1751, it's a tobacco plantation. Eleanor Darnall Carroll moves here from what's now Prince George's County. By 1863, its two plantations were on the southern edge of the northern of the two, called the Highlands, which went all the way to where the LDS church is. It's a good stretch of land. And then where the Army facility now is, I hope I'm pointing in the right direction, right? Yeah, was called the Edgewood. In 1873, the B&O Railroad put the Metropolitan line through. And so that cuts off this little slice of the southern edge of the Highlands. And a gentleman named Seymour Tulloch recognized a business opportunity and organized the Forest Glen Improvement Company, which bought a couple hundred acres of that slice on this side of the tracks and built the Forest Inn designed by Thomas Franklin Schneider, which was a hotel and part of a real estate development, which was not successful, unfortunately for Mr. Tulloch. And by what is now called the financial panic of 1893 was the coup de grace and killed the hotel. So the hotel closed, which then left the facility available to be rented by a couple who, in the 4th September of 1894, opened the door to 50 students at the National Park Seminary. And by 1937, it was the third and final president renamed it National Park College, and that's the period we're talking about. What was the educational program of the National Park Seminary and National Park College from September of 1894 through roughly June of 1942. In 1942, as part of under the War Powers Act, the Army seized the property and paid a fair penny for it, which by that time, the second president had purchased the Edgewood, so it included the whole, that was the entire, both the property that had originally been the two tobacco plantations had been reunited again under the second president. So they got a lot of land and facilities and turned it into a rehabilitation hospital. But that part of the history we're not interested in, we're not dealing with tonight. So now we can meet the folks. Here are the founders. These are the two people who established National Park Seminary. John on the left and his wife Vesta on the right. They met at Ohio Wesleyan University, where they were both students. John was a few years older than Vesta. He graduated, and then his first job was to be a teacher of science at an institution called LaSalle Female Seminary, which was just outside of Boston, and is still there. It's now LaSalle College. In the 1970s, during sort of the crisis in women's education, when a lot of places either folded or became coeducational, LaSalle chose to become coeducational. So it's now LaSalle College, but it's still in business. He taught there for several years. Vesta graduated a couple of years after him and taught for 1 year in a school in Missouri, and then moved to Massachusetts and married John. Their first child was born when they were still there in Massachusetts. Then he was given a job as a principal of a school, another girls' school, girls' seminary in Norfolk, Virginia. She went with him there, and their second child was born there. She was very involved in the running of the school, so she actually took the title of lady principal. So they ran the school, but were employees of the owner of the school, and what they wanted to do was own a school. So when the opportunity arose in 1894, they came up from Norfolk, rented with an option to buy, essentially, the hotel and the other buildings that existed at the time, which weren't that many buildings, and started the school. And continued to run it through 1916. Vesta unhappily died in 1910, suddenly and unexpectedly. John remarried and continued to run the school, but became much less interested in doing so and moved off campus into a new house and eventually sold the school in 1916. Oops. Meanwhile, under Mr. Cassidy, there's two particular folks of interest I'll just mention briefly. The two women at the top of the pictures. On the left is Charlotte Priest. She was hired in 1894 and was the first She had just graduated from what was then Columbian College, now George Washington University. She became the English teacher and is one of my favorite people. She was really quite extraordinary. And she spent the rest of her life here. She taught until her death in 1929, taught English. She's the one who started the original sorority program, that founded the original sorority. To her right is Catherine Munford, who came in 1907, became the dean fairly quickly after that, was the disciplinarian of the school, but she also taught a class on the Bible as literature, so she was also an educator. And she was here, still here, and still dean when the Army took over in 1942. So between the two of them, they really are sort of the soul of the educational program of the school, really, in addition to the presidents. So here's the second president who purchased, it was another man, an investor, the money man, actually bought the school under the provisions that Mr. Cassidy would continue to serve on the advisory board for as long as he wanted to, and Dr. Ament would be the president as long as he chose to. Eventually, in fact, fairly quickly, Dr. Ament actually was able to pay back the investor, and so Dr. Ament became the owner. He had a PhD. He was a president of a school in Oklahoma when Oklahoma was still a territory. So and then had gone from there to be the head of a couple of school districts in the Midwest. But he particularly was interested in women's education. So he was very glad of this opportunity and served through his death as president in 1937. He died in 1936. That's sort of the heyday of the school, of course. The school had gone from 50 to 400 students by 1929. And Dr. Ament is also the one who designed the ballroom where we're standing now, and his wife Teresa next to him. So after he died, Teresa Ament ran the school for a year and found it sort of beyond her capacity. So she was looking for a buyer, and that leads us to Ambassador Roy Tasco Davis, who purchased the school with investors, with the help of investors in 1937. Mr. Davis, Ambassador Davis, he had served as he had been an administrator at a school in Missouri. Then he became a diplomat in Central America, primarily I think Costa Rica and also then Panama, a Republican. And so when Roosevelt won in 1933, he sort of joined all the Republicans in exile and went back to education and back to Missouri, and then came here when that opportunity arose. He had visited the school as a kid when he was a congressional page and had always been interested in the school, so he was very happy to have the opportunity to buy it. And he was the one who was, he also then changed the name. He changed the name from National Park Seminary to National Park College. We'll talk about that a little bit in much more detail. And was the owner of the school at the time when the Army came in. So that's our three presidents. So now, my homage to Professor Hawking, brief history of education in the United States. And I really will try to be brief, but I want to put this a little bit in context. What we're going to be talking about is women's education, and specifically a girls-only school from the 1890s to the 1940s. And during that time, there was remarkable changes going on in American society, in technology and demographics, everything else, and in education itself. So there's a lot going on, and it all sort of impinges in one way or another on the way the school, on the program that the school adopts. And just to sort of put that a little bit in context, I want to first talk about the timeline a little bit. And I could do a lot of these sort of riffs, but I'm only going to do a couple because I don't want to take too much time. But one of the things I like to do when trying to figure out a time scale, today is March 24th, 2015. So if you hop back 120 years exactly, March 24th, 1895, excuse me, that's a Sunday. So in what is now the common room, that way, they would set up the chairs on Sunday and have their Sunday service in the morning, and then in the afternoon, a local preacher, in exchange for some cash, I'm sure, came and gave what they called a Sabbath afternoon address. So on March 25th, 1895, the address was done by a Mr. F. Ross, and his choice of topics that day was purpose in life. And so we have about 9 more weeks till the end of the very first year of National Park Seminary's life as a school. So it's exactly 120 years ago. To understand that time scale, what I find helpful is then just go back another 120 years, where do you end up? So that takes you to March 24th, 1775. Oddly, the day before, March 23rd, happened to be the third day of the second meeting of the Virginia Convention, which for reasons of personal security and safety, was not meeting in the capital, Williamsburg then, but in the little tiny backwater town of Richmond. And on that day, one of the delegates, who was well known for his flowery oratory, by the name of Patrick Henry, got up on his legs and gave a little speech, ending with the line, "I know what others may do, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." That was exactly 120 years back from the Sunday in 1895. So essentially, the founding of the school is exactly halfway between now and the beginning of the United States of America, which is completely, of course, a coincidence, but it's a nice sort of way to understand how the timeline fits. And I think, oddly, it seems to me, I'm not going to have to argue that tonight, but I think that we're closer to them than they were to the founding, it seems to me, even though the pace of change is faster now. I'm not sure that I'd love to argue about that, actually. But it turns out, and one of the fun things about working on this project was I had spent a lot of time in the 1890s in the last year or so. And the 1890s turns out to be this remarkable period when lots of things changed, from the United States being originally agrarian, becoming industrial and urban. Originally sort of a backwater little country, ends up being an imperial power with possessions in the Pacific and possessions in having defeated Spain at war. Lots of things seem to hinge on the 1890s, which happens to be the era that we're interested in. If you hop back, by the way, another 120 years, you end up in 1755. That's not quite far enough. You go back a little bit further, now we're on to education again. That's 1836, the founding of Harvard, of course, is the first higher education school in the United States of America. So we're about 2/3 the way back over from that. That's another big timeline, though, of course, now I'll stop. When Oxford and Cambridge got started, turned out to be sort of lost in the mists of time, but no matter how you count it, when Harvard was established, Cambridge and Oxford were already in a recognizable form, the kinds of institutions that they are today, longer than Harvard has been in existence now. So the education in the English-speaking world, the history of education is a very long story. The history of women's education, of course, much shorter, so we'll talk about that. That starts here in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And to think about that, it turns out there's a lot of really wonderful books on this subject, most of which were written in the 1970s, 1980s, and not surprisingly, 1990s, which is when in America we have this sort of revolution in higher education where we get all of the ethnic studies, so we get departments of various minority groups, including women's studies. So there's lots of books being written, and the academics themselves, of course, are kind of interested in the educational system and what happened to women in the educational system. So there are a lot of really good books at that time, almost all written from a sort of fiercely feminist perspective, which is not a surprise. Why wouldn't they be? It makes a lot of sense. And so they're sort of heroic narratives. It's the obstacles placed against women to prevent them from achieving education or obtaining education by men, sadly, although also some women. And then you get heroic efforts by individual women to create institutions that overcome those obstacles. So these are really good books, and I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to read them. And one of the questions that they look at quite deeply is, what was the purpose for the education of women? That was the social question. The interesting thing to me about that question is that the same question can be asked about the education of men, because it's not as if men were going to college either in those days. It's a very small percentage. And that's back to Harvard again, and then now we're almost back to the seminary, not quite. The easy thing to forget is that Harvard College, and in the colonial period you end up, there's essentially, depending on how you count, 8 or 9 colonial colleges. Each one of them was a religious school. The purpose of higher education in the United States in the colonial period was to train preachers, ministers. So you have the traditional education is Latin and Greek. But the Greek, it's just a little bit of a trick there. The Greek they're studying is not Homeric Greek, not heroic Greek, not epic Greek. They're studying Koine Greek. They're studying Greek to be able to read the New Testament. They also study Hebrew so that they can read, and not only the New Testament, but also the Septuagint, the oldest version of the Hebrew Bible, which of course isn't in Hebrew, it's in Greek. They study Latin to read the Catholic sources, and Hebrew to read the Hebrew Tanakh itself in the original language, to train themselves as theologians and preachers. All of those original 9 colleges, that was the purpose. None of them admitted women. At that time, however, women aren't being taught at all. There's the very beginning, at the end of the 17th century, there's a beginning of an effort to start to educate women, and as the literature asks, for what purpose? This is a surprise to me. The main purpose for educating a girl at that time was thought to be essentially twofold. First, and I don't want to argue this point either, but I just want to get it out there, the United States, except for Maryland, which was of course Roman Catholic controlled, and then you have to deal with however one wants to classify the Quakers in Pennsylvania, the rest of the English-speaking United States of America is overwhelmingly Protestant. So the main purpose for teaching a girl to read was essentially religious, so that she could read the Bible on her own. Then you wanted to teach her to do ciphers, you wanted to teach her to do reading and arithmetic. Arithmetic so that she could take care of her the household accounts once she became a wife herself, and make purchases and know how to make change and that sort of thing. The shock to me was reading, writing, arithmetic, the writing part. For a brief time at least, girls weren't taught how to write. It was thought that that wasn't necessary. They had no reason to write, so they signed things with an X. They didn't learn how to write, and then that changed fairly quickly when it became apparent that they would like to write letters and they would like to write other things. So eventually it did become the 3 R's. And so boys and girls equally were being taught the 3 R's. From there, then, we get into the question of how much more should girls be educated. And that's a long and deep and interesting story, but what it ends up in is what we can call briefly in America the seminary movement. So I'll just do a couple of quick things about that. The one name to name is Emma Willard, who establishes the Troy Female Seminary in New York in 1821. That seems to be, that's not the first, by the way. The first was in 1795, but it was by the Ursuline sisters in New Orleans. It's not part of the English-speaking, they're French. It's not part of the English-speaking tradition. And there was some Moravian or other Mennonites in Pennsylvania had a school before the Troy Seminary. But Troy Seminary seems to be sort of where the word seminary entered into the American English language, not anywhere else, as a girls' school. So boys went to academies, girls went to seminaries. Because this is the United States of America, of course, almost immediately there were female academies and male seminaries, and so the language gets all messed up. But that's the idea, was that the seminary was a girls' school. It's only in America, nowhere else was the word used that way. Emma Willard is wonderful and fascinating because she essentially, to learn sort of the mindset of a person, it's very hard to sort of think about what they thought about education. If you ask Mrs. Willard, should a girl go to college, she would have said no. A girl should be taught separately from me. Girls don't need to know what boys are studying. Girls should study the things that are appropriate for girls. But if you look at the curriculum of her school and the equipment that she had, what she was doing was working night and day to make sure that the education that was offered at her seminary was exactly the same as what was being taught to boys at school and young men at college. And so whenever there was a new development in the education of men in America, she would adopt it and incorporate it into the seminary program. If asked by her, should women vote, she would say no. It's fairly clear that towards the end of her life, under her, because of the goading of her one of her students, Miss Beecher, she seems to have changed her mind about that. But it's so interesting to me to sort of think about the fact that you can have different answers to those questions. Yes, you want women to have legal rights that are the same as men. They should be able to own property. They should be able to participate in society otherwise. And yes, they should be educated to their full potential. But no, they shouldn't participate in politics. It's an interesting thing, how those choices get made. The next person, yeah.
What year was the Emma Willard School?
She founded in 1821 in Troy, New York. And she was self-educated essentially. And that's always a sort of question. How did she learn? How did she become a teacher? This just happened slowly. The fathers who wanted to have sons and only had daughters would educate their daughters. Fathers who had sons and daughters would educate their sons, but let their daughters stay in the room. And they turned out to be better at Latin, say, than the boy was, and so they ended up teaching. Fathers who had sons would have tutors and were teaching their sons, and the daughter would, famously, I can't remember her name now, would sit in the next room and pretend to sew, but would listen to the lessons and end up up being better at it than her brother, and wanted something to do when she got out, and so what she would do is teach. Women would have economic difficulties and have to earn a living on their own. That's what happened to Mrs. Willard, essentially, and saw an opportunity and started teaching and took some students in her house and would teach informally that way. It just sort of grows in these odd, sort of unorganized ways and gets bigger and bigger and bigger until she finally gets to the point of being able to set up her own academy. She was really persuasive, though. She actually got the state of New York, she persuaded Governor Clinton of New York to provide money, so she actually got public money in part to set up her school. The next one is Mount Holyoke, and that's established in 1837, and I'm going to forget the name, Mary Lyons. There we go, Mary Lyons. Holyoke, of course, and it's Mount Holyoke Seminary, again. Holyoke is critical, and it's really the sort of the heart of the story because it goes on to become a college, right? That's the shift is made. Mount Holyoke is no longer just a high school with some other classes or this whatever in a seminary might have been in those days. It becomes a full-blown college. Meanwhile, Oberlin in Ohio admits African-American students and admits women and grants degrees to women. So while the education of women separately is happening, at the same time there's a movement to have co-education, and those tracks go together. And our friend, where is he? I've forgotten where he is though now, there he is. Our friend Horace Mann persuades America more or less single-handedly that at least from kindergarten through 12th grade there should be public education, and every town ought to use taxpayer money to provide an education for its children. And then it gets interesting. There's no theoretical argument really about whether or not you should have two schools, one for boys and one for girls. The fact of the matter is the taxpayer won't pay the money to do it. So you get co-education sort of automatically because each individual town or county wants to build one high school and let the boys and girls learn together. So that gets going. The second thing is, what are all of these now educated girls going to do? And teaching turns out to be a relatively natural thing for them to do. And don't come at me with pitchforks, but the thought was, since it's natural for the woman's role is in the house to teaching her own children, why doesn't she then go ahead and as a profession teach other people's children? Just like being a nurse, right? The woman takes care of the sick at the house, so why not have her take care of the sick outside of the house if you're going to let her work at all? That was the thought at the time, and it has to be admitted, again, whether or not there's any theoretical underpinning to it, they also were much cheaper. So jurisdictions were perfectly happy to have young women graduate from school, then teach school for a few years until they themselves got married and had children, because they cost less than male teachers cost. So you end up with this typical American situation where the women are doing all the teaching, but the principals are all men, right? The administrators are all men, but the people at the working level are all women, and that's thought to be an appropriate job for a woman. That pretty well gets us, I think we're now to 1894, I think that's right. I'm sorry, so after Holyoke, which then becomes Mount Holyoke College, then you get the other 6, 7 sisters are founded at various different times and become degree granting. So by 1894, when National Park Seminary is established, there's something on the order of 600 seminaries in the United States of America, and there are at least 7 all-women degree-granting colleges that exist. Oh, there's a medical school. In 1848, I've forgotten the name of it. There's a medical school for women specifically has been established. So it's not that there's no educational opportunities for women, it's just that they're different. And that gets us now, that's my probably not so brief history of U.S. education. I get to talking and don't know when to shut up. So the founding, 1894 to 1897.
Medical college in Philadelphia?
No, it's in Boston, I think, and I apologize. The name has just completely escaped my mind. It was at the same time that I think it might have been the medical college in Philadelphia began to admit women and actually graduate. The first graduate, it's just like with Oberlin, the first graduates of women who had medical degrees in the United States happened at the same time in 1850. A couple of them were at the coeducational school, and then 2 or 3 were at the women-only school. One of these odd things. Just a coincidence. So I throw in, this is the catalog, and I should talk about the catalogs for a minute. The source for the rest of my remarks now we're going to talk about National Park Seminary. The source for all of this is the catalogs that were published each year. And this is now my moment to make a plea for the SOS archives. We, as you know, we're doing a lot of work with the sculptures, and I'm a very proud member of the sculpture committee, and I'm very happy that we're going to be doing the Portrait of the Maidens this year. Another thing we've been doing is the archives, and I don't know if he's here. Chris is the chairman of the archives committee, and a professional archivist have essentially now gone through the one pass through the archives. And in connection with that, we were able then finally systematically to figure out what catalogs we have for what years. There was a catalog for 1894, which was before the school started, right? The catalog to get the people to come to the first school. And then a catalog every year, except for one, we think, in the 30s, one year during the Depression when they simply couldn't afford to publish another catalog that year. And then, of course, there was one for 1942 at the end. So there's essentially 48 catalogs out of the 50 potential. And it turned out that we had all but 6 or 7 of them, and then one of those we have now. And what I did was I decided to then get a hold of, there are a couple of institutions that have copies, but they didn't have any copies that we didn't have. It turned out that directors or founders did have copies that SOS didn't have. So I now have on hand a scanned set of all of them but one. The third catalog is the only one I haven't seen. So this is what led to me to decide to do this talk, was that I now had the data that I needed. So that's what one of them looks like, and I'll show you some others as we go. That's the cover page of the very first catalog. And I know you can't read this, and I'm sorry, and I won't wander over there, but this was what got me started. It's the course of study for the first year, and it's 5 years, sub-freshman, freshman, sophomore, junior. You don't need to read this, I'm going to get past it. I just want you to see what it looks like. And senior, so it's a 5-year program, and this is the English course. Then we have the Latin scientific course. Pause to think about that one for a moment. The Latin scientific course, then the modern language course, and the classical course. Each 5 years, and then over on the side is some additional courses, and I won't be able to remember them. I think it's music, voice, right? Voice, drawing and painting, and piano. So 5 year, 5 year, and 4 year. Now let's get to where you can read. So English course, Latin scientific course. What the heck is the Latin scientific course? The modern language course, where you're going to read some French and German in addition to English. English is taught as a modern language, of course, if you're going to do classics. And then there's the classical course. But in this case, it's divided somewhat differently. The first time I saw this catalog, which is one of the ones we have in the archives, I just couldn't figure it out. And so that's what, happily, there's a clue in the catalog that says, we fully endorse the program of the Committee of 10. And when I talked earlier about the 1890s being the fulcrum along which a lot hinges, this is one of them. In 1892, the president of Harvard and others had gotten to the point where they simply couldn't take it anymore because they were having a lot of trouble with high school students being admitted to Harvard and other colleges having wildly different abilities and capacities. It was completely unstandardized, which is one of those things, America, each individual school district should have its own program, everybody else be damned. But what you would end up with was there was a kid who would graduate from a high school and couldn't qualify for the college down the street because his high school didn't teach what was required to be admitted. And when you multiply that by people moving around a little bit, trains are available by this time, it really was a problem. So the American Education Association, the American Council on Education convened a committee of 10 to study the problem and make a report. And they then set up 9 conferences, each with 10 members, to report on the following topics: Latin, Greek, English, as I said, other modern languages. For that purpose, in those days, English is simply classified as one of the modern languages. Mathematics, physics, astronomy, chemistry, the physical sciences, natural history, which in those days had come to mean biology, history itself, and geography in those days, separate. So it's 100 people essentially, and they meet and they write a report. The name there's a couple of other fun names, but the name I'll mention here is one little guy off buried in the history. section there was an obscure recent PhD in history who had managed to get himself a job teaching at Princeton, who then developed an interest in politics and left academic life and was elected the new governor of New Jersey, and then very strangely got elected president of the United States. That's Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a member of the history conference of the Committee of 10. And their report came out in 1892, but was republished in 1893. And I know you can't read this, but it provided a whole series of possible curricula of the kinds of things that we think high school students should learn, but as a 5-year program rather than a 4-year program. And that was another big surprise of reading this first catalog. But I want to add, I skipped it earlier, but I mean, it was there. I just couldn't, I had to go over and read it. The cultivation of voice, which is a 5-year program, drawing and painting, a 4-year program, and piano playing is a 5-year program. Those were in addition to the other 4 major programs. This is fun because this is essentially the level of what were called ornamental classes, right? English or Latin is what you read in order to train your mind. But we want girls also to learn a little bit about playing piano and learn how to make a decorative thing for their house and that sort of thing. And they would said in the catalog that women should have a deep, cultured voice. So you want to learn how to cultivate your voice. But they took them quite seriously at National Park Seminary. So you could actually get a degree in piano or get a degree in art in addition to it as a decorative class. So who are these students going to be that are going to study for 5 years instead of 4 years? The Committee of 10, it was a 4-year program. This is a 5-year program with the same material. This was the Cassidy's idea of who's going to come to the school. Those desiring to be thoroughly prepared for college entrance, so you could come here, get your high school degree, and then go to college. Those preparing for advanced standing at college, that's the most interesting group. Those who simply want to do more than they could do in a regular preparatory class because you're going to get an extra year. Or those who, having completed their ordinary schooling, want a year of, and here's the famous word, finishing work. So never is it admitted, I don't know what they would have said under oath, but Mr. Cassidy and Mrs. Cassidy would not say that this is a finishing school. National Park Seminary is not a finishing school. But mom and dad, if you want your daughter to get finishing work, bring her here. And it should be said, and I don't want to, it is what it is, they priced the school, even this first year, to appeal to people of means. So this is not a school that just anybody is going to come to. It costs a lot to come here, and from the very beginning. I am always been interested in, it's not part of the topic tonight, but where in the world did they get the first 48 students? And it turns out, we know a little bit about that. Where they got them was they were the sisters and cousins and nieces of people who had known Dr. Cassidy and Mrs. Cassidy from Norfolk or from LaSalle. They wrote to those folks and let them know that they were starting a new school. Or they were people from the neighborhood. 3 of them were the Tulloch kids. Seymour Tulloch, who was the guy who had owned the hotel, had his, I don't know if they were his children or his brothers or his children, but 3 Tulloch kids came to school that first year. So preparing for advanced standing at college, what was that about? The idea was, come here, get your high school degree, and instead of going to college immediately, stay here at good old National Park Seminary for that second year, for that last year, and then transfer to your college at the sophomore level. So the judicious restraint in the home school in PS before she encounters the experiences of the higher institution where there must be more or less, that's a tautology course, it's true, there must be more or less freedom from restraint and independent action. So before you send your lovely daughter off to the wilds of wherever the college is, have her mature for 1 more year before all the restraints come off and she goes to spring break in Daytona. Okay, so that was, and I have no idea, unfortunately, one of the great sadnesses of the archive is that we don't have the records of the school itself in terms of who graduated and what they did with their lives after that. It's sort of a big hit or miss sort of thing. So I have no idea how many kids actually stayed for the 5 years, how many kids actually transferred to another school like Smith or someplace as a sophomore. No idea, but that was the idea, that was the selling point. One of the things that I think Ann put in the description of this little talk is that, hey, no exams. And it's true, so I just thought I'd throw this quote in. Periodical reigns of terror during which regular exercises are suspended and the brain and nerve of the student are subjected to crucial tests. I think that might have been cruel, in answering an exhaustive list of questions. Subserve, there's a word you don't see, in our opinion, no practical end. That's another one of these language mistakes. When it says in the catalog no exams, and it's in big letters, no exams, what they actually had in mind, I'm quite confident, was this was something that was part of the seminary movement in the late 1870s, 1880s, after the Civil War, but before the turn of the century. This would be a public event. They would have the girls who were graduating sit up on a platform, and usually like a professor from the local college or perhaps a minister would come and grill them all day. It was a theater sort of thing. It was a public, bread and circuses. And the girls would be expected to learn all this stuff and have it all in their memory. And it was apparently quite traumatic experience for some of them, although the townspeople loved it because the girls who were good at it got to show off. So that's what they mean by saying no examinations. There were none of those kinds of public, defending your dissertation sort of thing for the kids who were graduating. They still had tests. In fact, the catalog talks about that, periodic tests, as serving as a substitute for the reign of terror exams. And so now get out the pitchforks again. Here's a fun sentence on the educational philosophy of the school. Recognizing that it is the province of woman to throw herself heartily into the pursuits of others rather than to have her pursuits of her own, it is desirable to give her sympathetic insight into many different provinces of thought, rather than restrict her training to a few. Don't yell at me, I'm just the messenger. That's what the Cassidys wrote. I don't know what to make of that, but there it is. Women are not supposed to have their own pursuits. They're supposed to be helping other folks pursue. First 3 years again, the degree that was available, this is from the second catalog, not in the first, was Bachelor of Literature. So the idea was that if you did the 5-year program in the English course at least, you could get a Bachelor of Literature, and it took 5 years, okay? Those 3 years, by the way, also are memorable because it was during that time that the Cassidys had rented the school. They learned about halfway through their first 3 years that Mr. Tulloch had sort of omitted to mention that the school was the property was all subject to a mortgage, and the bank wanted the mortgage paid at the end of the 1897. So they really were scrambling. They had rented it precisely because they didn't have the funds to buy it. So they had to find investors. They incorporated it. It was a big problem. They ran on a shoestring those first 3 years in order simply to be able to buy the property outright by 1898, by the middle of 1897, so that they could be the outright owners and then go from there. And I think, let me just sneak into so this is now the Lucy Mercer, the Lucy Merritt, I forgot her name now. Lucy Mercer was Franklin Roosevelt's girlfriend. Lucy Madeira, sorry, there you go. This is the Lucy Madeira story now. Lucy Madeira of the Madeira School graduates from Vassar and needs a job, and she can't find a job. She had expected to teach Latin at a school here in Washington because she was from this area. This is one of my favorite books of the whole thing. And so Lucy comes back to Washington. She hopes to teach Latin, but the other guy she's competing against a man, and for the job, and he happens to have a letter of introduction from the President of the United States, Grover Cleveland. And so he gets a job, and she doesn't. So she has to do something, so she takes a teaching job temporarily. This is Where Girls Come First by Elana DeBear. And it's a wonderful book. She's not an educator or a historian. She simply was a mother whose daughter was going to school and getting ready to go to school in the 1990s, and who liked the idea of separate education for girls. So she and a group of other people actually founded a school for girls, which is in the Oakland area of San Francisco. This is her book about that. And in the book, she also gives a history. She hops back and forth. One chapter will be a history of the seminary movement, and then the next chapter will be on her experiences of setting up a school. So in the chapter on the Madeira School, she writes, oops, wrong page. I'm not reading this, I'm paraphrasing because it's copyrighted. So she taught temporarily as an expedient for that first year at a poorly run girls' school. By the way, quick footnote, this is the be careful what you wish for because you might get it. As I'm reading all of these histories of higher education of girls, I keep thinking, well, somebody's got to say something about National Park Seminary, right? I mean, there's got to be something about that. Here you go. The school had a ballroom with count them, 4 tiers of boxes. I count 2. But only paid poor Lucy $150 a year. And they made her stay in a room with another teacher. And in fact, the room only had 1 bed, so she had to share a bed, and she had to share a room and share a bed with another teacher. And they didn't even have a dresser or a closet in the room. They had to keep their clothes in suitcases underneath the bed.
Sounds like my dad.
There you go. And they walked to school every day uphill both ways. Yeah, exactly. So she then moved on to the more suitable Sidwell Friends School and taught there for a while, and then sets up the Madeira School. The implication being that Lucy had such a terrible time at this unnamed, poorly run school that she, when she founded the Madeira School on her own, she obviously ran things much more smoothly. What's fun about this is, of course, no 4 tiers that I see. And this room, as you all know better than me, was done in 1927. Lucy was teaching in 1897, so there was no 4-tier ballroom in 1897 when Lucy was here. And that was at the end of that period I'm quite confident that the Cassidys were making everybody sleep in one bed and not have closets, because they were spending every penny they had to try to buy the school so they didn't lose it. This is the official Madeira School history. One of my former employer's daughters is graduating from Madeira this year. It's still there, of course. Lucy had the good taste, the good sense to make a really good friend of Catherine Graham's father. So they ended up on 360 acres in Rolling Hills somewhere in Virginia, because Philip Graham was quite generous. So I am reading, but I'm reading things that are not copyrighted. This is a copyrighted book, but it includes quotes from Lucy. She earned 100, so she accepted a post as history teacher at National Park Seminary, a private finishing school, in Forest Glen, Maryland. She earned $150 per year plus room and board. Quote, I roomed and slept in a bed with a young teacher of music from Charleston, South Carolina. We did not have a closet, nor a bureau, nor chest of drawers, and we had only 1 dormer window in our tiny room. We kept our clothes in suitcases under the bed. Years later, she had just 2 free hours in the whole week when not teaching or chaperoning or proctoring to study hall or doing clerical work. In addition to preparing for her next day's teaching, she laughed off her ignoble position, had a good time with the staff, and enjoyed the foolishness of the year. So you get a rather different sense of Lucy's experience at National Park Seminary. And to my knowledge, that's about the only time that National Park Seminary is mentioned in the literature of the higher education of women. They were successful, the Cassidys were successful, and then now we begin the transition years. When does it go? Here's my next chore is, how does it get to from being a 5-year high school to being a 2-year junior college? So 1897 to 1899, they dropped the Latin scientific course, and it's called National Seminary for Young Women. And this is what these wonderful books look like. This is a nice example of this. We call them the Little Green Books. This is the original catalog, the way they were printed by the George Baldwin Company, and they look like that with black and white. These may have been photographs, but they look like drawings, the way they're reproduced. So this is one of those catalogs. And the only change in the program is no more Latin scientific. Now it's English, modern languages, and Latin. You can transfer credit from accredited schools if you want to come in from elsewhere, if you've previously taken a few years at another school, and still a 5-year program. So now, 1899 to 1901, we dropped the whole business of English, modern languages, and Latin, much less Latin scientific, and now it's just you can get a Bachelor of Literature in English, history, mathematics, Latin, science, modern languages, or the library courses. So it's a series of courses, always, of course, started with Latin. Our friend Charlotte Priest is the main teacher. A degree requires 25, quote, major courses, and you get 5 major courses per year. So it's still a 5-year program. Take 5 classes a year. Major is in quotes because it's not clear what that means, and 2 minor courses make up a major and what's a minor is sort of difficult to understand even from the catalog. I'm quite sure the girls understood it perfectly when they were here because it was talked about a lot, but just reading the catalog it's hard to understand which is which. So then 1901 to 1904, the degree still requires 25 major courses, but you take 4 major courses a year, so 4 times 5 is only 20. In fact, 4 times 6 is only 24. So it's question mark, but I think by now it's sort of becoming a 6-year program. And then they add the domestic science and art course is added during that period. This would be the interlude to tell the Ellen Swallow Richard story, but we're probably way over time, so I'll not. Now, a fun tour of the facilities. This is the famous building that if you go across, between the gym and the Aloha, there's that parking lot, and you go straight across Linden. In those days, later on, there was added a walkway. There was a big building there where the townhouses now are, and that's Recitation Hall. It was originally set up for the sororities that didn't have their own sorority house yet, but once all the 8 sorority houses were built, then it became Recitation Hall, and it was the main classroom. So there's a classroom, a typical classroom in Recitation Hall. Although this one may have been in Maine. I don't know that that's in Recitation. It's called Recitation Room. I believe it's in Recitation House as well, or Recitation Hall. Sadly, I don't have records about what the pedagogy was like. I can talk about the curriculum, but I can't talk about the pedagogy. I'm not sure what it means to recite English. I think there was a lot of memorization work, but it's clear from the few letters of Charlotte Priest that I've had the privilege to read so far, it's also clear that she's got the girls reading Shakespeare in addition to memorizing dates of Shakespeare's plays and that sort of thing. So that's the chemistry lab. That's that funny building that's part of the apartments that I'll probably point in the wrong direction. That's got the big granite staircase. The bottom floor was the chemistry lab, and the top floor was the art studio. It's built separately from behind the ballroom here because if it burned down, they didn't want it to burn down the rest of the buildings. So it's apart from the rest of the buildings. And this is, you can't see it, unfortunately, it didn't reproduce very well, but up in the corner is a cooking class, part of the domestic sciences program, and then below is a sewing class. These are obviously posed pictures. I have no idea what the girls look like normally, during the day, but this is what they want the parents to see of what a typical cooking class looked like. So finally, between 1904 and 1913, it settles down. This is the 1904 catalog, makes it clear. A degree requires 24 major courses. There are 4 major courses per year, so it's a 6-year program. In addition to the curricula that we've already seen, they would add programs throughout the years. They kept adding programs, so dressmaking, stenography, typewriting and bookkeeping. Domestic science was a separate program. The business course, the secretarial course, shorthand, typing and shorthand, that sort of thing. I think the library course was already mentioned, and they did establish a course for journalism. So it was a really wide-ranging, and as they got more students and more money and built more buildings, it was a very wide-ranging set of opportunities. And then what happens then in 1913, by 1913, I can prove this, they clearly had changed. And it was a 2-year program that was really a junior college. And you could go to high school here, you could go to high school elsewhere, but you can see the name. So it becomes official. The name changes, although they don't change the formation of the school. It's the National Park Seminary, a junior college for young women, not just a school for young women, or the Glenn School. Okay, and in fact, I have a catalog which is happily assigned by the girl who attended Tubman High School in Augusta, Georgia, named for, I think it's Emily Tubman, who was a philanthropist, not Harriet. And she graduated from high school in 1910 and then comes to National Park Seminary and is here for 2 years and graduates from National Park in 1912. So the next year it becomes official, it's a junior college. And in fact, from 1913 to 1922, there's no preparatory school. They deleted the high school. In 1922, 1925, through 1937, they went back and added the preparatory school. So back to being a 6-year program again with a high school. And then from there, notice, I don't know if you noticed, I meant to mention this before, none of this has anything to do with the transition from Mr. Cassidy to Dr. Ament. He didn't make any changes in the program. Finally, Ambassador Davis, Dr. Ament dies, Ambassador Davis takes over, and it becomes National Park College, a junior college that is at that time an associate member of the American Association of Junior Colleges. It becomes a full member. And Ambassador Davis announces that it's going to be a vocational school. But in fact, when you drill into the program, he doesn't change the courses really at all. So it's just a matter of emphasis. And one of the questions I wanted to ask was, did it change in fact? And these statistics don't really mean anything, but it was the best I could do with the information that was available. 1905 and 1907, you see vocational, you had the general folks, the folks who are getting the English degree, 80%, 90%, and only 3% or 13% or 8% are getting vocational degrees. In the Ament years, it's 75% with 20%, so it's gone up, getting vocational programs. And then under Ambassador Davis, it's not that different from the way it was in Dr. Ament's time. So it's not clear to me that it became a vocational school under Ambassador Davis. And that's it.